Greetings and welcome to another meeting of Theology Matters. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors of the Theology Matters series. First of all, the Graf Chair in Catholic Theology at Creighton University, and then also St. Pius X Catholic Church Parish. I'd like to thank especially Father Joe Ray for supporting this lecture series, and then the members of the Theology Matters Planning Committee, Colleen Sasula, Rosie Volkmer, and Cindy Sauer. I very much appreciate their work in putting these lecture series together. Tonight we are very fortunate to have with us renowned author and speaker, Dr. Massimo Faggioli. He's professor of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University in Philadelphia. His books and articles have been published in more than 10 languages. He is a columnist for the magazines Commonweal and La Croix International. His most recent publications include the books A Counsel for the Global Church, published by Fortress 2015, The Rising Laity, published by Paulus 2016, Catholicism and Citizenship, Liturgical 2017, The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Orbis 2020, and then forthcoming Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, Bayard 2021. And he is co-editing with Catherine Clifford, the Oxford Handbook of Vatican II, come out in 2021, and is under contract with Oxford University Press for the book God's Bureaucrats, A History of the Roman Curia. So he's very widely published, prolific in his writings, and we're very fortunate to have him come and speak with us via Zoom this evening. Pope Francis' 2020 encyclical Fratelli, Tutti on fraternity and social friendship presents a vision of social friendship in the one human family that highlights some tension with the American and also the American Catholic project. Dr. Faggioli's talk will discuss these traits of Fratelli Tutti in the context of a particular moment in the history of the Catholic Church in the USA. As the second Catholic president in its history, President Biden takes office. Dr. Faggioli will present for 40 to 50 minutes, and then we will have 30 to 40 minutes for questions and answers. Please submit the questions through the chat feature on Zoom. I'll group and synthesize those questions to allow for the greatest coverage. My name is Todd Salzman. I'm a professor of Catholic Theology at Creighton University and currently hold the Graf Chair. So I'm very thankful for their sponsoring these types of events. One final comment. Dr. Faggioli, being from Villanova, we've set some strict ground rules. We've agreed not to discuss the merits of Creighton's versus Villanova's basketball programs. They're 1 and 2 in the Big East, and have agreed to follow Pope Francis' charitable dialogue and focus on less controversial issues such as religion and politics. So we look forward to a very stimulating, dynamic presentation and discussion, and we look forward to the question and answer session. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Faggioli. The title of his talk is What Fratelli Tutti Says to America and American Catholicism. So welcome, Dr. Faggioli.
Okay. It's something that really I feel part of my vocation, of my job, to share what I happen to discover in these texts and through different readings and research. So what is interesting in this encyclical and is particularly interesting for America and American Catholicism? Well, first of all, because it was published in a very particular moment which is just 4 weeks before the election of the president. So it was published on the 3rd of October. And actually there were many people, myself included, that before it was published had doubts that this encyclical would be published before the election, because I thought it's going to become really part of the campaign, and so it is unlikely that it will be published before the November 2020 election, because it speaks so much, I mean, directly on some American issues, and so we will see how many and how crucial they are to our debate. And the second element of context is that every document of Pope Francis in these last few years can be read with a specific attention to North America, to the United States, and to American Catholicism, because this pontificate of Pope Francis can be seen, and this is one of the attention of my book on Joe Biden and US Catholicism that was published last week, that with the first non-European, non-Mediterranean Pope and the first Latin American Pope, what happens is also that the papacy starts to look at the United States and at American Catholicism with eyes that are significantly different from his predecessors that were all Europeans and whose relationship with North America was shaped by other factors, especially historical and political. So here Pope Francis, as a Latin American and Argentinian Jesuit, he has, quite honestly, a more critical view of the American way of life and of the American dominance in world affairs, of the American model of capitalism, and so on. And so this is the first thing that we have to say, because we have with this Pope a more global Pope, so a Pope who's more sensitive to the instances and demands of the Southern Hemisphere, which means also a more critical eye to the role of the United States in world affairs, and also to the role of the North American Church to the US Church. And so this is just to begin to say that there is a whole element of context that we should remember. So there's a second element of context, which is that this encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, is an encyclical that has an explicit ecumenical and interreligious intention. It's one of the major texts of this pontificate that has in mind this goal of helping the construction of a new social model and of a human fraternity. So why is this ecumenical and interreligious goal of Pope Francis meaningful for the understanding of this document and what it says for the United States? Because for Pope Francis, as a Latin American Jesuit, again, ecumenism and interreligious dialogue is something a little different from what ecumenism used to be in the 20th century, because ecumenism is born in the early 20th century as a European project, which very quickly became a North Atlantic project. So Europe and North America. What we see now, and here the election of Pope Francis has been a very, very evident, symbol that something was happening, is that for Pope Francis, interreligious dialogue is not really limited or focused as it used to be until John Paul II, the church and Judaism, but the very big goal is to have better relationship with Islam, which means a different area of the world, which entails that also the analysis of the church for a certain economic model, social model, political model tends to be different, and I would say more critical, because the perspective is no longer of a Western, European, North American, Judeo-Christian perspective, but it is shaped and it's understood through the eyes of those who are also Muslims. And so this is very important, because it's a big priority for this pontificate. And the final element of context is that this document says a few interesting things on the United States and on the US church, while at the same time it is a document that doesn't have the goal to address ecclesial issues. It doesn't talk about how the church should change, how it should be. Or if it does, as we will see, it is very indirect, because it's about a social model, an economic model, politics, culture, and so on. It's not really about the church, the Catholic Church, or the churches. Okay, so here, what we have to do is to look at what this encyclical says to culture and society and politics in the United States, and indirectly see what is the support or the criticism on these very issues that the encyclical is talking about from the US Catholic Church. And so the question is, what Pope Francis says here is the same that the US bishops say or not? It's the same of what US Catholic theologians say or not? Because we have seen in these last few years that this is it has become a very big issue, because historically Catholicism in the United States has been, in its clerical and episcopal component, I mean the US bishops and the US clergy, historically have been very Romanized, very papalist, which is something that suddenly, with the election of Pope Francis, is no longer true, or no longer necessarily true. Okay, and so here you see that there has been an inversion, a reversal of sympathies and antipathies from the US Catholic Church towards Pope Francis that we should remember, because there is, in what Pope Francis says on a certain economic, social model, there is implicitly, I think, a criticism of something the US Church, in its hierarchical component, has most probably failed to say or to notice. And so we will see what really exactly. Okay. So here, once I've concluded this introduction, so here let's go through the chapters of this encyclical. So this encyclical has 8 chapters, and so it's a very long text, and it's full of Pope Francis quoting himself. which is non-typical. It shouldn't be that way, honestly. I've said something. It doesn't look extremely good in some cases. Okay, so but this is really Pope Francis. It's his voice. He quotes many of his speeches and other documents and so on. So here, chapter 1. I would say rename the first chapter as a criticism of the American model and not necessarily of America. Okay, so here in chapter 1, for example, at paragraph 33, we have a criticism of the ideology of the freedom of the markets as magically self-regulating and so on. This is not per se a criticism of the United States, but it's a criticism of a model of capitalism that has become global, that has become universal. So here there is, from the beginning, a description, and it's very negative. And so here, chapter 1 can be very depressing. So it's a picture of the world that is not optimistic. So here there are a few key aspects that this article sees in the world of today, which is the dominance of a certain economic model, the dominance of a certain model of digital communication and of technology, and the development of digital relationships, a certain lack of etiquette or style in the media, which this document says this happens also in Catholic media, and the tendency to make hierarchies between different cultural identities. So here, this first chapter is really not about America, but it's about some common aspects that have become part of the global culture as the product of globalization that has been massively shaped by the Western Hemisphere, by modern capitalism. And so here there is nothing that we can really say, well, this is about America. Okay, so it's about the Western system that has become global. The second chapter says, I think, a little more about America, and about America as a nation, as a culture, and as a Catholic Church in this country. Why? Because the second chapter is the theological engine of the whole encyclical, because it's an exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, why is this chapter, I believe, interesting in a way that I believe thinks about the United States and American Catholicism? Because it is a warning against religious hypocrisy. So here there's a very strong paragraph. For example, 86. So there is, for example, also a very clear reference to issues that historically have played a critical role in the relationship between American religiosity and social issues, for example, slavery and racism. So here at 86, for example, this is very striking because, and this is typical of Pope Francis, this lack of fear. He's not embarrassed by saying these things. He says, quote, I sometimes wonder why it took so long for the church unequivocally to condemn slavery and various forms of violence. Today, with our developed spirituality and theology, we have no excuses. Still, there are those who appear to feel encouraged, or at least permitted by their faith, to support varieties of narrow and violent nationalism, xenophobia, and contempt. And so this is really strong. And so it doesn't mention one country by name, but it says the church has taken too long to acknowledge the very serious sin of racism. We have no excuse now. Nevertheless, there are those religious people that feel legitimated by their own beliefs to continue in thinking in racist terms that now we call nationalism, xenophobia, but it is still a view of other human beings in a hierarchy of those who are higher and those who are lower. And so this is, chapter 2, I believe it gets closer to an indictment of some ills that are typical of a culture that is deeply religious, but at the same time seems to be, in some areas, in some quarters, in some circles, to be blind to what theology and history have taught us, that, faith can really become a justification for racism. And so this is very central in this document because it's a document on human fraternity. And so the anti-racist motif in this document is extremely strong, very strong. It is probably the strongest one. And of course, we all know that all cultures, all countries have gone through experiences of, racism and so on, as victims or as perpetrators. But in this country, it is central in its history, the experience of the Civil War, which was also a theological crisis between those who were justifying slavery with scripture or with tradition, and those who were really fighting against with the same scripture, but interpreted differently. Now, chapter 3, it says something on the North American model to the American model because it is a great call to participation. It says much of the tensions in this world now, these days, come from the gap that there was between the promise that was given to people that they can participate in society, in the economy, in politics, and they found out that there are systems of exclusion that are still very strong. So this is important because participation is one of the key words of the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, especially Gaudium et Spes, when it describes what in the opening speech of the Second Vatican Council, Pope John called a new order of things. October 1962. So here Pope John was a man who was born in 1881, a deeply conservative, but he understood that one of the major engines of social change was the demand for participation in society, in the economy, in politics, in culture. And so to some extent, we're still there. And so we're still, trying to understand how can we make people participate more. And so here, Fratelli Tutti, chapter 3, it's a call for a world, for an economy, a politics that doesn't exclude. And of course, this is a major theme in this country, because if we have learned anything from these last few years, is that there are tensions very high tensions between different ideas of how to make this country and this church also more open to participation of new voices. It is about gender and it's about race mainly. And so here the encyclical is calling to this need to be more open to participation. So here there is a paragraph 102. So there's a very, very nice sentence, which is a quotation from Paul Ricoeur, this French philosopher. He says, we no longer talk about other people as neighbors, but as associates. So which is a whole different thing, because it has to do with the workplace. It has a business echo. I mean, associates, while neighbors is more existential, is more physical, is more living together, right? And so here there is a very strong attention of the Pope for the acknowledgement of the worth of every human person and against the systems of exclusion. So here again, there is a call to pay attention to how words can be misleading and to the whole theme of hypocrisy, which is a major theme in the entire pontificate of Pope Francis. He's a very patient man, I believe, too patient with some people, I guess, but he has no patience with hypocrisy. You can see that. And so he says, for example, in 110, indeed, to claim economic freedom while real conditions bar many people from actual access to it, it is to practice doublespeak. There's a whole economic theory there that is being dismantled under our very eyes, because this is so there is a call, which is one of those things that have triggered the screams of the free marketers. He says the right to private property is only a secondary right. So which is not new at all. I mean, if you go back to Thomas Aquinas or the canon lawyers of the 11th century, 12th century, they were all saying the same thing. The right to private property is a secondary, it is subject to the common good. It's always been like that. Now it looks revolutionary, communist, but actually it's much older than Karl Marx, much, much older. And so this is clearly a reminder to a certain Catholic culture of capitalism that has become turbo capitalist and not Catholic, no longer Catholic. I have no fear of saying that. I mean, this is, and this is very much really part of the power system in this country, in the United States, even in US Catholicism, of the power brokers in the US Catholic Church are now, as you know, I mean, we're very wealthy people that have always, pushed for lower taxes, all of that. And so this encyclical is clearly taking a strong stand. And of course, the Pope cannot force anyone to, with the Swiss guards or whatever, to change. But with this document, it's clear that it has become harder for some Catholics to say, well, actually, I'm following Catholic teaching. Well, no, it's no longer possible to say that with nonchalance. And so this chapter 3, it's really focused on access, on equality, equity, and so on. Now, chapter 4 is not as evident what it says to the United States and to America, but there's one thing. In chapter 4, there is a critique of a false universalism. So here Pope Francis says, human fraternity requires a coexistence, a balance between local and universal. Being focused on our local situation only makes us very parochial in the worst sense of the word, and only being universal make us citizens of the anywhere. And our local relationships don't matter because we can move everywhere anytime and we have no relationships really. Okay, so this is, I believe it says something to a certain global capitalist ideology of the anywhere, that you can produce anything anywhere and it really doesn't matter the local conditions in which those products are produced, so those economic systems are implanted. And so this is really a third worldist, I would say, argument against a false universalism. Chapter 5, I believe, and it's more subtle here. So here, chapter 5 is a great call to rediscover politics as a noble vocation, which sounds easy. It's not easy at all, because in these last few years, especially in the United States and in the Anglosphere, I would say, I mean, UK, and we have seen a double attack on what is a classically Catholic understanding of politics and of the state as something that is essential for the common good. So here it may be complicated, but so in these last few years, what happened in the Catholic Church in the intellectual debate has been an attack from the right against the idea of the state, because we don't need state government. We just need to have our money to pay lower taxes, and then capitalism will take care of all of us. Okay, so that has been an attack against the idea of the state at the service of the common good coming from the right. But there's also been from the left and from theologians for whom I have great respect, and an attack against a traditional Catholic idea of politics within the state, because state has been accused of being at the roots of every possible evil, war, racism, violence, colonialism, all of that. So there has been this double attack from the right and from the left. So which is, I have to say, it is typically American, because you don't find that in European Catholicism and even in other countries, simply because, especially in Latin America or Asia or Africa, they are not so ready to criticize so harshly their new states when they remember very well what it meant to be under a colonial empire. So, I mean, state can be messy, but I mean, being subjects of the colonial empire was not necessarily better. Okay, so here Pope Francis, I believe, is making a very important point, because he's saying, let's not forget that state and government can be very important to protect and promote the common good. If, I mean, so there are problems there, but so here Pope Francis is really a 20th century Vatican II Catholic that has understood politics and statecraft and so on before they came under attack, especially in these last 20, 30 years, because so both these tendencies, both the right-wing tendencies and the more radical orthodoxy, they really emerge in the 1990s. Okay, so it is 30 years more or less that there is this crisis of legitimacy of the state and of government, also within Catholicism, and I have to say specifically in English-speaking Catholicism, in the United Kingdom, for what it's worth. I mean, a very small church, but much more in the United States. And so this chapter in Fratelli Tutti, I believe, is courageous because it's saying in code, but not so much, Pope, I believe that the state is important to help people that cannot help themselves, right? So this is the whole point of state, and this is, I believe, one of the most fascinating moments of this encyclical. Now, chapter 6 is interesting because there's this attempt to save the idea of culture from the culture wars. So it's a whole chapter on the culture of encounter and the encounter of cultures. So which is interesting because if you live in the United States and in the US Catholic Church, whenever you hear culture, 90% of the time you know, or you're afraid that what follows immediately is wars. And so this chapter says, well, actually cultures is something that they can talk to each other and they can encounter each other. And so this is, now let's go to the chapter where I believe most explicitly there is there's a criticism of a certain American model, or this moment especially. So here there's a huge thing. It says, and it quotes John Paul II's encyclical of 1991. It says, for the Catholic Church, not every social conflict is bad, which is huge because all of us in these last few decades have been fed this idea that if you are a good Catholic, you just stay quiet, which is not at all how this Latin American Jesuit knows things work. So there's this idea that, and this says a lot to our country now, to our church now, no reconciliation is possible without justice. I mean, how much can you build on this, on race, on gender, on economic justice, and so on? So here, it's not a pope who says, well, be quiet, everything will be fine. Not at all. Not at all. It says there are conflicts that need to happen or need to be understood. I mean, what happened? Because otherwise they stay buried and they will continue to produce conflict. So this is not the typically Catholic, I mean, law and order perspective. But as we know, that is a very strong instinct within Western Catholicism. I mean, not only in the United States, but I mean, honestly, what we have seen in these last few months has been a scary scenario of a country that has a hard time imagining itself staying together. And so what is the message of the church on this? What kind of conflict is justified and what isn't? I mean, is the assault on Capitol Hill a justifiable conflict or not? I believe not, but it takes care to make distinctions here. And then there is, at the end of the 7th chapter, there is a very clear, call against the death penalty. As you know, the United States is the only major constitutional system that still has death penalty, that has been abolished in most other democracies, especially constitutional Western. And there's a whole discourse on the justice system, so which would warrant a whole night of discussion. So what is the culture of Catholics on this? I just remind you that when Pope Francis in August 2018, he changed a couple of words in the catechism to say basically death penalty is no longer acceptable for the Catholic Church. The most important letter of protest against Pope Francis came mostly from North American Catholics, because there is still in some Catholic quarters an attachment to the death penalty as something that is rooted in an understanding of the tradition that I believe is allergic to the idea of development and of learning from history. But I have to say, and this is the most shocking thing for me, it's also blind to the way death penalty is imposed, is carried out. So with what kind of distortions in the justice system, in the access to justice, to lawyers, and so on. That is the most shocking part for me, honestly. And this document is very clear in saying we are against death penalty, not just because we know that it is cruel and so on, but because we know what happens before death penalty. So that there's a whole system of justice that is distorted from the very beginning. And that's why on death row, you have a certain kind of people. And so this is not something that you find in this document with so many words, but it's clearly that awareness. And so I believe that says something on what kind of message there is there. And then finally, chapter 8, last chapter, it's a chapter on this link between religion and violence. And so this is extremely complicated because in some sense, this document makes a step back from what I believe was one of the great courageous, step forward of John Paul II, who in many statements, he basically said, if there is violence in religion, it's not always, and not necessarily when religion is a victim of that violence. Okay, but religion can become violent. And so we need to do something. So here in this chapter, there is Pope Francis who's trying to defend religions from violence. Why? Because this document is also talking to and with Muslims. And of course, this is a big issue, especially in these last 20 years. But it's important, this chapter in America, especially because there is a clear awareness that there is no future peaceful coexistence between human beings in the one human family without a system of freedom of religion for everyone. As you know, America, the United States, is at the same time the first modern nation which is built on religious freedom, the Pilgrim Fathers, the First Amendment, and so on. But at the same time, in these last few years, we have seen that in this very country, there have been calls to limit the freedom of religion of those who are non-Christian. And this is enormous in the eyes of those who know something of history. And so this document makes a very clear call for a universal system of protection of the freedom of religion, and this is important, and not in a way that emphasizes the fact that Christians are persecuted. So which happens in many countries, but I don't think necessarily in the United States. So it's important because this document restores a certain balance to the real challenges for the freedom of religion that exist in reality, no question about that, but really not in the same terms they are presented by those who claim that in the secular United States, now Christians no longer have the freedom to worship freely. I mean, this is a different take that this Pope is taking on the issue of the freedom of religion. And so, as a conclusion, so this document is, I believe, very important. It's not a perfect document, so there are flaws, as I said, also because I believe that those who should have helped him, I mean, writing this didn't really help him very much. So there should have been more care in how to build a certain argument, that because here there are some passages where it seems that these big statements are Pope Francis' intuition. Well, actually, they are 8-9 centuries old. And it would be important to say, well, actually, this is very old. It's not something I came up with yesterday. Okay, but it's a great document because it's very courageous. It is very courageous in taking a position on issues that are typical of our global disruption in society, in the economy, in politics, and in religion also. Because, and this is why this document is important for us in this country, here Pope Francis has this problem of a divided world, of a world where there are many disruptions. But it's also in some countries, and in this country especially, an ecclesial crisis. And so there is a Catholic disruption going on. So there are very different cultures and very different ideas about who is member of the church, who should be member of this country, who should be given titles, who should be given back something or who shouldn't. And so it's an ecclesial crisis. And so I believe that this document can say something to a disruption in this country and in this church that I'm afraid is going to continue for a while. I mean, I don't have to hide. I mean, I wrote a book on Joe Biden and I tried to be, fair and to see some shortcomings of him as a candidate, as a Catholic, but it's clearly sympathetic because I believe that the worst is over. But it's not all over. So there's something that will continue because this is also a church in this country that cannot really agree on something that I find basic, like death penalty. It's just one example, right? And so I believe there are some things that are really challenging for this church. And I want to conclude with two questions, or two doubts. One big question mark of this encyclical is that here Pope Francis is trying to renew Christianity and to renew Catholicism, but in the context of a church in which in these last few years we have seen movements that want to go back to a medieval Christianity. Middle Ages that never existed, of course, because they want the Middle Ages with social media and all of that. So it's impossible, clearly. But this is really part, especially of churches like this one in this country. So this document is clearly not welcome for some members of the Catholic Church. And at the same time, this document offers a vision of religion and of Christianity with a confident approach to the possibility of living together, Christians, non-Christians, religious people, secular people. So there's a very strong confidence. I believe that can be done. The biggest challenge is that this confidence seems to be lacking in many of us. I have doubts myself that it is possible to coexist in my same Catholic Church in some days. So it's a very inspiring document that is based on this idea: we live together, we can talk to each other, we can reach a consensus that is more advanced and it's more meaningful. The biggest question is, do we believe that this is possible? As Americans, this is a question that is maybe tougher than for others. And not because we are worse or less intelligent, but because we are going through this particular moment of deep division. And so this is our context in which we have to read this document. So there's no other context we can read this document. It's our time. So we have to take it as it is and make the best of it. I would stop here. I thank you for your patience, and I'm really looking forward to your comments or questions or anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faggioli. Very nice. It's a very nice synthesis of the document in a very limited time, but it really touches on some of the high points and important challenges that Pope Francis is throwing out to move us towards solidarity and promoting the common good in spite of many of the social and structural challenges that tend to oppress and frustrate attaining the common good. So I open it up for questions. One person submitted a question. Let me see, I gotta move up here. He says, I'm surprised that there is not an address of fundamentalism in light of the current global issues. Perhaps reflect on that in the context of the trouble of moving forward in social fraternity.
So, there is a section on fundamentalism in the final chapter, especially when he talks about the link between religion and violence and terrorism. So it is very explicit. But at the same time, so here I believe Pope Francis has adopted a vision that is that tends to be more friendly to Muslims, which is this. Religion is a victim of violence, and it is really not so one of the factors of the roots of violence. So this is something, so this is an intention of this document. I believe it is more complicated. Okay, so here Pope Francis is talking about that, and here fundamentalism is just one of the possible distortions. Okay, because so here historically fundamentalism is typical of the Christian churches of the Reformation. Okay, because fundamentalism means a particular way of reading scripture and of applying that in the political, in the social political sphere. While for Catholics, historically, that the temptation of using religion in a violent way is called integralism. So that is less based on scripture; it's more based on papal teaching and so on. So here I don't remember if this document talks explicitly about fundamentalism or not, but clearly it says we have this problem now, and it's interesting that is not giving to the temptation that, well, this problem of the religious violence is of others, but we Christians are fine. No. He says it's a problem of the religious phenomenon. And so it says that, and actually, interesting, in the Vatican, on Tuesday and Wednesday, there was a meeting organized by the Vatican with Christian and Muslim experts to examine the problem of fundamentalism. And so there was a seminar that was revealed yesterday by the Holy See Press Office. And so this is something they are very aware of. And it's a common issue that has huge ecumenical implications, interreligious and political, of course. But this is a very good question because it's the phenomenon of our age. It was simply not there at all at the time of the Second Vatican Council, for example. It was really not there. It is totally a post-Vatican II phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. Another question came up with concern about the male language dominating the document, and that's always been the case in Vatican documents. But I mean, especially when Pope Francis is talking about issues of oppression that are especially related to gender and race, why not a greater sensitivity to language in the document itself, perhaps?
I totally agree. This is really unfortunate because, so at the beginning, the problem seemed to be only with the title, Fratelli Tutti. And they said, well, but in Italian, it is inclusive, which is, I mean, half true. But anyway, so it could have been explained like that. The problem is that if you look into the text, I mean, of the 288 footnotes, there's not one woman. I mean, not even Saint Clare of Assisi, for God's sake. I mean, they could, or when he talks about immigration, I mean, mention Saint Francis Cabrini, right? Something like that. This is really a problem for Francis and all of those who work with him. So here, there's no other way than to push and tell them until that will go. So here there is, in some sense, so there are cultures like Italian cultures that are behind. so that are less sensitive to this than North Americans. And so that is used as an excuse often by the Vatican. But on the other hand, there is really a lack of knowledge of feminist theology, of the tradition by women. It is really not just a matter of language, but also of knowledge that the tradition is not a male tradition only. That's
Okay, thanks. Another comment question, a challenging theme. Consensus is a challenging theme in a win-lose society and worldview. I think we need to really model that and work with folks on that. Ecclesial leadership may not model that either. And just sort of a follow-up comment to that, it's really interesting to see the public disagreement among the bishops that have become very vocal. And in a way, I think that's a healthy reality to show very clearly that there is division in the church. But is there a way synodality invites that dialogue and discussion to move forward? But the polarization can be an impediment, I think, to overcoming that polarization and that sort of win-lose mentality. Could you comment on that, Massimo?
sure. I mean, in Commonwealth today, my piece on exactly this went online. So where I say this, I say that, so there's a problem of polarization. So no question about that. And that is really a major concern when you want to open to a synodal process. Okay, because synodality means involving in some way the whole people of God. Now, the problem of the US Bishop Conference, for example, it's not only that it's not synodal, because that's so evident, but it's not even collegial. And so collegiality should be simpler because they're all bishops. I mean, the same anthropotype, I mean, the same. And so they should at least being able to discuss among themselves in a healthy way. So I agree that a synodal process can expose and create further rifts, yes. But we are even one step behind because, as I say, as in this article today, the USCCB is no longer a bishop conference, an ecclesial body, is a federation of episcopal committees. And so you have a bunch of committees and everyone has a piece of the portfolio and they say one thing, one other thing, but you don't have a body of bishops that has a healthy way to, make decisions. And so you're right that lately we have seen, after the fall assembly of November and after the statement of the USCCB president on inauguration day, we have seen voices saying, look, we don't agree on this, or even worse, we were not informed. I mean, I'll give you one example. One can think many things about Joe Biden and his position on abortion and his access to the Eucharist. But it makes no sense that in the task force created by the USCCB to address the issue of Joe Biden and the Eucharist, in that task force, there isn't the ordinary of Delaware, where Joe Biden comes from, and the ordinary of Washington, D.C., that canonically are those who are the only ones who can decide on that. I mean, that makes no sense at all. Makes no sense. Why were they not included? so there's something that is so strange. And so here we need to go back to a healthy collegial way of working, and then we can explore synodality, but we are one step behind, I believe.
I don't have any more questions on the chat, but I have one question. One thing that struck me about the encyclical is there, I mean, I don't know if the word is actually used, structural sin or social sin, but it's throughout, right? It's talking about economics, about culture, about oppression, about racism, etc. And there's a tendency I find both with John Paul II and with the bishops in their own document on race and other issues to reduce social sin to personal sin, and then not to adequately deal with the reality and the power of structural or social sin, systemic sin that's perpetuated, and especially racism and on gender issues, on LGBTQ issues. So that reductionism often prevents any mobility or action to really work at deconstructing those systems. And it's reduced to, well, don't be a racist or don't be a misogynist, etc. But that's not where the problem lies. In my conversations with people, no one's a racist, but they do racist things. They have racist attitudes, but it's a systemic reality that perpetuates that and in a sense justifies it. And it's kind of what Pope Francis was saying about why did it take so long to condemn slavery or violence, etc. Yeah. So
I agree with you. So here I agree, and I would say this, that Pope Francis is very good in talking more explicitly about structures of sin and not really reducing them to a personal issue of attitude and so on. So he's good on that, also because that comes from his being Latin American, who as one person coming from an area of the world that was subject to colonial empires, you have a better grasp of the structures of sin. Where Pope Francis shows limits, in my opinion, is in doing the same thing for church structures. There, it tends to be defensive and to say, well, don't be clericalist, right? But there is very little effort in him to make the same move that he's making with capitalism and so on in the church. And so this is my bigger criticism of him. I mean, I like him, but I believe there is a limit there. And in some sense, we're going back to the whole debate that was typical of John Paul II, do in racism and so on. Is the church as such that can be sinful, or are only members of the church can be sinful? Now, in light of what we know of the sex abuse crisis, that distinction, only members of the church are sinful, but the church institutionally cannot be sinful, I believe it's much harder now, right? And so this, it's one of the limits, I believe, of Pope Francis, who talks about clericalism a lot, but honestly, we don't know what is happening structurally to tackle the problem. It's more a spiritual, encouragement. And so this is, but I agree with you. So we're still dealing with an individualization of the issue in the terms of one by one, but there are things that don't work this way.
Thank you. I had another comment or question. You mentioned that Francis cites his own works and exhortations, talks quite a bit. What would you say is the most novel advancement that Francis makes in this encyclical? Clearly, you have addressed key themes tonight, but if you had to pick one that Catholics should digest further, what would it be from your perspective?
So I believe, this may, I believe that this document should be read together with what he's trying to do with Islam. So 2 years ago in Abu Dhabi, the statement that he signed with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. In March, maybe he will be able to go to Iraq and to meet with the world leader of the Shiite Muslims. And so this is really, I believe, overall, one of the biggest things that he's doing. Because, in these last 20 years, a lot of things have happened in our lives, in our countries, and so on. I believe that for the church and for religions in the world, we are still really living in a post 9/11 world. And so we have gone through the Great Recession of 2008-9, and then Donald Trump and Brexit, all that. But for religions, 9/11, I believe, is a watershed. And so here, if you remember, in the first few years after 9/11, even in the Catholic Church, you could see some instincts to say, well, ecumenism was meaningless, and Vatican II was really bad because we cannot talk to these people, and so on. And so here Pope Francis is really trying to recover from that trauma. And so there are intra-Catholic issues that he's talking about here, as I said tonight, on the economy and so on, society, death penalty, and all that. But overall, he's a pope who's really trying to build one human family, beginning from religions and civilizations. Cultures, much more than nations or. So this is, I believe, it's the biggest thing. The announcement that was made this morning that if he goes to Iraq, he will meet with the leader of the Shiite in Najaf, who, remember, was one of the worst hit cities during the Iraq war because of the civil war between Iraqis and Iranians and so on. It was really hard to imagine anything like that just a few years ago. And I don't know if it will happen, but the fact that Pope Francis has announced that he wants to go there and meet with this guy, it's enormous to me. It's enormous, and it says a lot about how his perspective is shaped by a vision of the world that is not centered on Europe, is not centered on North America. Yeah.
All right. Any questions from the audience, if you wanted to? I have one comment question. I always get very frustrated when the church talks about subsidiarity and participatory justice and economics and politics and society and culture, but they always leave out one crucial element, the church. And I know Pope Francis, much of his papacy has been defined in terms of synodality, and he's done a much better job than popes in the past of trying to realize that. But the church doesn't have the infrastructure. I know Germany is working on that, and the head of the German Conference of Bishops came out with a statement that the church needs to change its teaching on homosexuality and ordination of women. I mean, that's radical stuff, but it came out of this dialogue. But there's such a resistance to that idea of lay voices, Newman's three magisteria, the theologians, the episcopacy, and then lay people. And until that changes, the power and the structures are going to prevent a synodal church, I think, and prevent a growth in terms of the church, because people feel alienated. Power is a huge issue, and I think Pope Francis is addressing it, but it still hasn't permeated the institutional ecclesiological structures. So if you could comment on that.
I agree with you. So I've studied for an article that I submitted yesterday, all statements of Pope Francis in these last 8 years on synodality. And this is my hypothesis, is that his pontificate starts very strong on synodality. So we need to do this to change structures and so on. Then he sees what happens at the synod on the family and marriage and the reactions to Moris Laetitia, and he sees what's happening in Germany with this radical stuff, as you said. And my impression is that in this last year and a half, he has become more cautious. And to understand what's going on with this pontificate, the most important source is not just what he says, but also what Civiltà Cattolica, the magazine of the Jesuits that it's in Rome, says and publish. Okay, so because they leak things and they cannot, so they make us understand what's going to happen. And so in these last few years, there have been two important articles on synodality in Civiltà Cattolica, one from the editor and the other from a Jesuit Cardinal Michael Czerny. And the impression I get is that they are saying, well, don't expect big structural changes. Do expect a better way for the existing structures to function. And in this article, I say, well, maybe there's a reason for that. I believe it falls short. So you're right. So here there is, I mean, big statements and a big vision of Francis. But again, when it's about, I mean, changing some structure, Francis is reluctant, probably because he knows how much resistance there is. And he probably fears that if he proposes something now, the next pope will undo this in a way similar to what Joe Biden is doing with Donald Trump. I mean, an executive order and so on. So this is what I think is slowing down a little. So but there is this very interesting experience in Germany, but also in Australia, the plenary council. So they have started to prepare the first plenary council for Australia since 1937. And so this is very important because so there's a whole process of involving all lay people in all of Australia, which is a continent really. So it is logistically also. So there's something happening. And so we are in a better situation than we were under John Paul II, for sure, or Pope Benedict. But clearly our expectations are higher than what may be delivered, probably.
Thank you. for that. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Faggioli. It's wonderful presentation and synthesis, and thanks for your thoughtful responses. We're very pleased to have you, and we hope we can come back at a certain point.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much, and stay safe, and I hope you don't get too much snow.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to Villanova and Creighton, we're going to have a tough battle there.
I'm an atheist on that. I'm not.
All right. Thanks again. Thank you all for being here and participating.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have
Bye-bye.
a good night.
Thank you.
Todd,
Yes.
good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You texted or put in chat, this is an important point. I have no idea what